I'm going to talk about housing, and the reason is not just because I love talking about housing, which I do, but because housing is very important to the broader economy. And one of the reasons I was very bearish about the economy for several years was because the housing market did so badly. And it's no coincidence that recovery in housing has led to recovery in the broader market. So even for those of you who do industrial, office, retail, property, hotel, you should care about the housing market because the housing market tells you what's going to happen to the rest of the economy a couple of quarters later. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So my agenda is I'm going to talk about house prices. I'm going to talk about housing demand, sort of the long-term trajectory for housing demand, particularly focusing on demographics and income, and particularly referring to some work that I'm doing with one of my PhD students right now, Hyo-Jung Lee. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Fannie and Freddie. Now, I'm just curious in the room, how many of you care about Fannie and Freddie? Okay, about half of you. The rest of you should care about Fannie and Freddie, and I'll talk about why in a bit. Okay, but let's start with a chart that just shows something pretty basic, which is how much housing are we building every year in this country. And if you go back to 1959, in the average year, we have built about 1.5 million housing units. As you can see, we essentially never have an average year in housing. We either build too much of it or too little of it. We need to build too little of it for a while because we've built too much of it previously. One favor I asked to home builders, and they never seem to be able to come through on this, is to just build 1.5 million houses a year. If they could just build 1.5 million houses a year, the economy would be much more steady than it is, because housing leads the business cycle like nothing else does. We had a new GDP number out this morning, fourth quarter growth a little more than 3%. That's after the third quarter growth of a little more than 4%. Those are pretty good numbers. Why did we have those pretty good numbers? Because we started to have real recovery in residential construction in the fourth quarter of 2012. And generally, it's 2 quarters later that you start to see that show up in broader GDP numbers. It took about 3 quarters this time for it to happen. But I think there's a very strong connection between this and the GDP number. As you see, it's come substantially up off the bottom. We're about 65% higher now than we were at the bottom of the market. But that said, we are still at about 1 million a year being built. As I said, normal is 1.5 million. Residential construction is usually 5% of GDP. So being at 2/3 normal, we are still shaving about 1.5 points off of GDP from where we should be just from housing alone. And 1.5 points is a big number. It doesn't sound big, but it's actually a big number, particularly when it compounds over time. So we have some recovery. By long-term standards, the number is still terrible. Will this number continue back up to something more normal? And I think the answer is yes, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. Okay. As for house prices, what's happening there? First thing is, if you bought a house in Southern California in the year 2000, you are better off than if you have bought in any other city in the United States in 2000. So basically, if you bought in 2000 and you didn't take any money out in a refinance, you are really sitting pretty right now. Now, alas, there aren't all that many people you could say that about, but nevertheless, if you look long-term, housing in Southern California, Los Angeles, Orange County, has been a reasonably good investment despite the boom and bust. If you bought in 2005 or 2006, you're still a very unhappy person, but if you put 20% down, you're actually pretty close to being right side up on your loan, too. And so the share of people who are underwater on their houses in Southern California has dropped precipitously in the last 18 months. That's important to the broader economy. People feel more confident. People feel like they can spend money. So this recovery in prices has been important. Now, will this increase continue? And the answer to that is, I think, no. It's this sort of sharp recovery in prices. And here's Los Angeles. You can see it's really jumped up. I expect that now to flatten out for the next couple of years. The reason for that is house prices are where they should be. Now, what do I mean by that? Is if you look at a person making a choice between owning and renting, financially, what's the better thing to do? Well, if you go back to 2005, renting was the better thing to do. In fact, I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, but I remember saying to my wife in 2005, when my little house in Bethesda, Maryland, became suddenly a seven-figure house. I never thought I'd own $1 million house, but there it was. I said, we should sell our house and rent, and she looked at me like I was insane. So that conversation didn't last very long, but nevertheless, the fundamentals were just not there for the prices. In Washington, in Southern California, in San Diego, a whole host of other places. Really, the Inland Empire, Bakersfield, Fresno, Modesto, and so on. When we got to the trough, it was in the other direction, is if you could get a mortgage, and the if was a big deal, then owning was clearly a better option than renting financially. It was a no-brainer thing to do. Right now, where we are is at a point where it's about an even money proposition. It's not particularly better to own or to rent in Southern California financially. It's expensive to own, it's expensive to rent. If you look at the cash flow carrying costs, it's quite similar. It depends a little bit on the neighborhood that you're in. But the point is, we have come back enough to where prices are fundamentally where they should be, which means that we don't want them actually to go up much more, because then we get ourselves into the sort of trouble we were. People ask me if we're in a bubble. My answer is not yet. If prices level off, and they have pretty much leveled off over the last 6 months, then we don't have a bubble problem. If they go up another 10% in the next year, then we start to have issues. So I expect prices to stay about the same. Okay, what about demand? Where is it coming from? Well, we have a demographic phenomenon called the baby boom. I like talking about the baby boom because I'm a member of the baby boom, and as you all know, baby boomers are narcissistic. So as a narcissistic baby boomer, I like to talk about my generation. It's about a quarter of the country was born in the baby boomers generation, another quarter millennials. About 40% of households are headed by boomers, and about 40% of the labor force is headed by, that should be 38.2%, something happened there, of labor force boomers. So they're still important. The only thing economists are good at predicting is how old you're going to be 10 years from now. Our forecast on that is really excellent. And what we see is this phenomenon of here are the boomers in 2000 were between ages 35 to 55. So their prime working years to now they're moving into the cusp of retirement. And so a big question is what happens when the boomers retire? Is there going to be a collapse in housing demand? I argue the answer is no, because there's been a fundamental change. Okay, if you go back 30 years and you look at what happened to demand for housing by age, it peaks at age 37. This is in 1980, and then falls thereafter. Okay, what's going on there is people in their 30s and 40s in 1980 were just much richer than people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s because they were better educated. You had a generation that one generation had about 12% rate of college degrees. The next generation was about 27%. So you do the same exercise now. You look at housing demand across the age distribution. You could see it peaks at about age 43, and then it stays pretty much flat. Okay? Now, there is a brief period of downsizing between ages 60 and 70. What that reflects is the fact that if people are going to downsize, they do it when they retire. But if people have not downsized by the time they're 70, they're not going to do it. They're going to stay in their house until somebody carries them out. And so this idea that suddenly there's going to be this big load of houses on the market as people retire, I just see no evidence in the data for. I think people stay in their house. In the meantime, millennials who are young now do actually start to enter the housing market. In the next 15 years, enter their prime home buying years, and they will push up market demand. Bottom line, when we look at housing demand, we expect over the next 10 years for it to increase a little under 1% a year based on demographic and income change. This doesn't sound like a big number, but it's actually a quite large number, and so we expect housing to be very healthy. I want to point out one other thing is demand for housing by different ethnicities. And again, this is not stereotype. This is, we're looking at data. We're seeing how much housing do people demand, controlling for their income and education. Asians and Latinos demand more housing than non-Hispanic white people do, for whatever reason. They just consume more of it. If this pattern remains stable, as we see a country that becomes increasingly Latino and Pacific Island, that should contribute to this increase in housing demand. One other point on demographics. Single people demand more housing than married couples do because they're not dividing their housing with others. And the consequence of that is that as we stay more single, we will actually see more, not less, housing demand. The configuration of that might be different. And the interesting phenomenon is the marriage rate has just plummeted in the U.S. And I suspect I know the reason for it. Ross Douthat in the New York Times says it's because it's contraception. I think it's something else. I think we have gone from a country where men are better educated than women to a country where women are better educated than men. Among 25 to 29-year-olds, women are 8 percentage points more likely to have a college degree than men are. Men seem to be willing to marry women who are less educated than they are. Women do not seem to be willing to marry men who are less educated than they are. And I think this is what's pushing back the marriage rate. And this has some pretty profound implications for housing, for home ownership, and a variety of other things. I see I'm about to get the hook. I just want to make one point about Fannie and Freddie. First of all, there's a new director. The new director is loosening. This was Ed DeMarco. He was tightening. Mel Watt is loosening. So mortgage credit may be a little easier to come by in the next couple of years. But long term, what's going to happen over the next 4 years, my prediction to 6 years, things are going to be pretty much left alone. I don't think that's the long-term answer. But as long as Fannie and Freddie are bringing $15 billion into the Treasury every quarter, which they are right now, there's not going to be any sense of urgency to quote-unquote do anything about them. So.